What's going on, guys? My name's Jordan. I'm the head coach here at SaberSim, and I am very excited to announce the release of our XFL simulations and lineup builder beginning with week 2 of the XFL season for 2023. Our team has been hard at work on getting this out for you guys here beginning with week 2, and it is now up in the app. And I just wanted to record a quick video walking through my XFL process, how I'm planning on using the sims and the builder here to build lineups for these contests. Before we get started, I do think this actually is a pretty interesting opportunity from an EV standpoint in DFS. There's not a lot of good information out there in XFL. There's not a lot of other strong tools or content in this space. And when we have these opportunities and we have a great tool like simulations and SaberSim to build lineups, it does create a pretty unique opportunity. Similar to Formula One releasing last year, we made a big push to get sims out for that, and our subscribers crushed Formula One early on in the season there while everybody else was trying to catch up. I think we have a pretty interesting opportunity as well here for XFL. So it's definitely going to be something I'm playing. If you've been itching for football or just something else to play DFS for during the week, definitely recommend checking it out. But let's go ahead and just dive in. I'll talk a little bit about what's going on here behind the scenes and how I'm using SaberSim to build my lineup. So first things first, this is a full play-by-play football simulator, very similar to what we're doing for NFL. We've got our average projections and ownership up in the app, but along with that, we are actually simulating these games out play-by-play thousands of times, giving you the ranges of outcomes that you're used to within SaberSim, the correlations, and pulling that data into account automatically. This is a massive edge in a sport like XFL. Your lineups are going to be nicely correlated and pretty well diversified right out of the gate. So a lot of what I'm going to be doing here is letting the sims do a lot of that work for me and adding value where I can in certain parts of the process. So first things first, on the home screen, one of the places that I think there is an opportunity to add a little bit of value here is to the ownership projections. Our ownership projections are going to be really solid here. They're based heavily on our sims, so identifying what the field is going to see as the best plays and where people are going to start their lineups. However, because the XFL player pool is probably not going to be as familiar to a lot of people as something like NFL, I think names that stick out are very likely to be a little bit chalkier, maybe even chalkier than our model is going to project. We actually saw this quite a bit in week 1. Guys like Josh Gordon, Martavis Bryant, even like Geronimo Allison, all a little bit chalkier than I think you might normally expect just looking at the projections and salaries alone. And it's just because these are names people recognize. They're used to playing them in NFL DFS or season-long fantasy football or something like that. Very easy to click on names that look familiar. So I've actually just been going through here and doing a quick spot check. You can do this by salary or by ownership or whatever makes sense. And if there are names that are jumping out to you, like if you are honestly thinking, unless you're an XFL sharp and you know all of these guys already and you've been watching training camp and things like that, but if there's names that jump out to you because you remember these names, they're probably going to jump out to other people as well, especially when it's a position like wide receiver where there's a ton of these guys in the pool here, and there's going to be certain names that jump out more than others, right? Josh Gordon is a huge example. I would take the over on 36.5 ownership projection, might bump him up to something like 45. I think Geronimo Allison as well. He was a chalky play last week that didn't really produce, so it might be that people are off him a little bit, but maybe people playing for the first time this week I think are just going to be more likely to play him. It's a somewhat recognizable name there. Martavis Bryant is another big one. People remember him tearing it up for the Steelers back in the day. I think he's going to be a popular play. Running backs as well. A couple past NFL players, Brian Hill, Kalen Ballage. You can go down this list here and just look for names that, again, I really do think it's a good way of doing this is what names jump out to you because they are recognizable. Those names will probably jump out to others as well. So I like making a little bit of an adjustment to ownership projections. I'm not making a lot of adjustments to projections otherwise. The models team has put a lot of work into this model. It's taking into account usage rates, Vegas totals, our perception of the skill level of these players as a whole to come up with our projections. So I don't have a lot of value to personally add here. I will say on that note, because the XFL is fresh, just week 2 of this season, but we don't have a lot of basis points for how these teams play together with these exact rosters. There is going to be some volatility naturally in a lot of these projections. If you are the type that likes to do a little bit of research, listening to podcasts, people following maybe the beat writers pretty closely here, or whatever beat writers there are for XFL, and you think there's an edge, maybe a guy that's going to be a little bit more involved in the offense this week, or maybe a guy that was very involved last week that you don't think is going to be as much this week, I think making adjustments to projections makes a lot of sense. I would start with 10 to 20% adjustments based on the base projection from there. So if you identify a play that you do kind of like, maybe a guy like Brian Hill, right? Maybe going to be a little bit chalky, but he's a guy you like. Maybe start with an adjustment of 2 points here, which is kind of between that 10 and 20% range. See the impact that has on your builds and go from there. So not a spot that personally I feel like I can add a lot of value here because I'm not as familiar with these players here, but I do think it is a sport and a contest type where it does make some sense to make adjustments based on research because there is a lot of volatility in some of those projections. Now, that's basically going to be the extent of what I'm focusing on here on the home screen. I do just want to call out the lineup rules section over here on the right. If you know, for example, that you want a certain construction in your lineups, maybe something as simple as a QB plus at least one in every lineup, I think it can make some sense to set a rule. I just wanted to make sure that people know where that's at. Very easy to add basic stacking rules or grouping rules or things like that. I'm not going to do that here for this build. I found that in some of my initial testing this morning, the correlation and the sims themselves do a great job of building the lineup constructions that you would want and you would expect to see in your lineups. I think you can also make some adjustments post-build from there, so I'm not going to set any rules, but if you know what types of lineup constructions you want here, you can go ahead and set that in the lineup rules over there. So let's go ahead and get some lineups built here. Our sliders that we're using for most of these contests are going to be very, very similar to what you've seen in the NFL lobby for a 4-game slate. They will be almost identical or very close to identical on the sliders here, and I'm not making a ton of adjustments. The sim diversity is going to be pretty high. It's a 4-game slate in a high variance sport. We want that diversity to be high to take advantage of the game scripts that are in the sims and also give us a wider range of outcomes across our pool here. Correlation is actually set at low. It's 1. A lot of the reason for that is that the sims themselves are going to be carrying a lot of that correlation weight. You'll see in just a moment. Don't really need a lot of very high correlation to get the stack types that you're looking for and expecting here. And the ownership fade slider is an interesting one. I think I'm going to leave this here at around 3 for this particular build, especially because I've already added some additional value by making adjustments to ownership projections. I do think this is a game type where ownership is going to take a little bit of a back seat. And the main reason why is because I don't think that the lineups that the vast majority of the field are going to be even very good just based on average projection. I think between correlating our lineups and building lineups that are projected very highly, we're going to get a big edge on the field of people that are just using bad information or are hand building and just don't know the player pool very well. So we don't need a ton of leverage on the ownership angle to differentiate ourselves from the field. We're going to get differentiated pretty naturally here just by building well projected lineups. So we'll go ahead and get this build started. So I'm not going to make any adjustments to the build settings here. We'll get this build started, and I'll start talking about what I'm going to do on the build screen, which if you've watched any of my videos before, you know that this is where I typically like to add a lot of value. So we'll let this build wrap up here, and we'll start taking a look at the build screen. So first things first, a couple things that I'm going to be looking at right away is I do want to diversify this pool. I want to make sure that I'm playing a set of lineups that have high upside, but I don't typically want all of my eggs to be in any one basket or too many of my eggs to be in one basket. I want to play an appropriately diversified pool of lineups. And the way I've typically been doing that is with the min uniques player option. My favorite way to use this, and this is a heuristic, but I found it does a good job of balancing lineup upside with diversification, is to set this at whatever one less than whatever the maximum value possible is here. So you can basically find what the maximum value is by setting this high enough such that you're not getting the number of lineups you requested back out. So in this case, if we set min uniques equal to 5, I'm only getting 19 lineups back out, which means there's only 19 lineups in the entire pool of 500 here that have 5 players unique from one another. So I'm going to tick this down here and figure out what that true maximum value is. And with 4 min uniques, I'm getting my 20 lineups back out here. So 1 less than 4 would be min uniques equal to 3. And that is probably where I would settle in here. And we can actually see now it's going to diversify my player exposures here a little bit more. And as we scroll down and look at the bottom lineup in the pool, my lowest ranked lineup is ranked 80th out of 500. So I feel like that's a very good balance here of playing lineups that have high upside while also diversifying myself by making sure those lineups are different enough from each other. The other thing I want to do in the build screen is review my lineup constructions as a whole. I want to see what kinds of stacks I'm getting here. So we'll go ahead, we'll turn auto exposures on, and then I'm going to go over and look at my stack types. And this is what I was talking about before, where even with correlation just at 1, the value of the sims is showing through and building us some really nice constructions here. We're getting stacks that intuitively make sense for a football slate. QB plus 3, QB plus 2 with 1 run back, 3, 1. Things are looking pretty good here. Just a quick note for those that don't already know, a secondary stack is a stack of players that does not include the quarterback. So in this case, a secondary 1-1 means that those lineups, they may also have a quarterback stack in them, but there is a player on one team and an opposing player on the other team also in that lineup that doesn't include the quarterback of either of those two players. So similarly, secondary stack 2 players on the same team where the quarterback is not included. So I'm not going to be very strongly opinionated here in terms of what stacks I'm getting. I'm going to trust the sims quite a bit to give me the right constructions. It is just a 4-game slate. It's important to remember that. So a wider variety of lineup constructions here are viable compared to what you might have on a 10-game NFL slate, for example. But I do like to do a little bit of trimming. In particular, I'm not totally bought into the idea of a QB plus 4, especially just with the 7-person plus a defense type lineups. You're asking for a pretty extreme outcome there for a QB plus 4 to pay off. So that might be a lineup construction that I remove. And I think want my quarterback to be stacked with a pass catcher in every single lineup. So I'm not getting any no QB stacks here, but if there were any no QB stacks here, I would probably do a little bit of cleanup there. But otherwise, pretty happy with how these are looking here. So the last thing that I'm going to look for here is I'm curious to see how my exposure looks like to some of these very highly projected, I think, popular plays based on name value. I looked pretty good here. I'm about even with the field on these guys. I also, if I was, maybe still getting a ton of exposure to a guy like Josh Gordon, who really, to me, sky's the limit in terms of how high his ownership could get. I could see him being a very popular play. Did score a touchdown in week 1, name value. So it might be a guy that I'm interested in fading a little bit. I may test the fragility of these projections a little bit here and just see, if we're off by 10% in the wrong direction here, what does that do to his exposure in my lineups? And again, explore some of these just household names. Feels funny saying household names when we're talking about XFL guys here, but just tweaking those projections down just a tad. I'm basically just saying, if these players, if we're within the range of error for these guys on the downside, I just want a little extra weight towards fading some of the players that are just going to be very, very popular plays based on their name value alone. So that's a little bit more of kind of an intuitive feel thing. If you don't feel comfortable doing that, I think it's totally fine to skip that. But again, before Josh Gordon goes out and scores 3 touchdowns and totally burns me this week, I think he's going to be a very highly owned play, and I think there's a lot of volatility here in some of those projections. So finally, the last thing I'm looking at is players' status. In particular, the questionable players, and going through and checking what questionable players I have in my lineups. The injury reporting for the XFL is notoriously bad. I've been digging around this weekend, and I can't find an official source with these injury reports here for these teams, whether that's on Twitter or even the official XFL injury report site, which apparently has not even been updated since last season, week 6. Here with any updated information. It does look like this DK Nation page does have kind of a nice summary page with some additional information about the status of players that are questionable, but there's just not going to be very good reporting for questionable players. So I think there's a couple ways to handle this. If you've got a read or a source that you think will be able to provide accurate information here leading up to the lock of each of these games and feel comfortable playing questionable players, I think that's great. I think I'm going to be pretty conservative with this. I think it's a sport here where, the information is not very reliable anyway, and there's probably a wide variety of viable lineups, especially if you're just playing 20 or so lineups, that I'm at least exploring the idea of just fading some of these questionable players and hoping that I can get there with a lineup with guys that I know are going to be playing. I think one of the easiest ways to do that is to just test it and experiment with removing those players from your pool. So I have no questionable players here, and seeing how far down into your pool do you have to get to play lineups that don't include those players. I'm still pretty comfortable playing lineup 178 out of 500 here. This still looks like a good upside lineup, QB +3, decent overall projection, so I'm pretty happy with that. But just because the quality of news that is out there, and it seems like even according to the official XFL injury report, it's going to be pretty tough to get up-to-date information on some of these guys, I'm going to lean on the conservative side with how I'm handling questionable players because I don't want to zero in my lineups. Other than that, I'm feeling pretty happy with this lineup set as a whole. I've got a nicely diversified portfolio of lineups that have been built and optimized with our sims. I'm feeling really happy with our lineup constructions overall. I've got a couple players that I think are going to be very popular plays that I'm taking some negative leverage stands on, and I've diversified my portfolio with the min unique. So feeling pretty happy about this overall. We'll wrap this up by saying, I do think XFL presents a pretty interesting EV opportunity for SaberSim subscribers here. There just isn't really a lot of quality tools out there, and the experience level of a lot of the players in your contests is going to be pretty low here. And the Sims just give you a massive edge over that majority of the population playing these contests here. So I think it's a fun opportunity here, a fun sweat. Looking forward to getting my lineups in play here tonight. In the meantime, if you have any other questions about XFL on SaberSim or any other part of the SaberSim process, you can reach out at support@sabersim.com or in our Discord server. And in the meantime, thank you for watching and good luck.